Okay, good morning and welcome everyone. We're so excited that you can join us for today's Dean Book Review, this last full week of January. I don't know where the time went. It seems like 2022 just started and here we are kind of at the end of the month. My name's Elizabeth Kronk Warner. My pronouns are she and hers, and it is my privilege to be the Dean at SJ Quinney College of Law. And as I like to do anytime we gather to have discussions, I do want to acknowledge that the land that I'm coming to you today, which is in the Salt Lake Valley, is land which is named for the Ute tribe. It is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. We here at the University of Utah recognize and respect the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. So I'm really excited that we can be here today for this important community outreach activity and gathering to discuss an important topic. And today's Dean's Book Review holds kind of a special place in my heart. We've been doing this for almost 2 years. We started in March of 2020 as a way of connecting during the pandemic and while also talking about important issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion for the legal profession. But this is the first time that one of our students has recommended a book and is also serving as a panelist. And that's Kim Koeven, and they will have an opportunity to introduce themselves a little bit later. But I just want to acknowledge their contributions to today's panel and just kind of specify that it's an extra special panel for that reason. And I'm really excited. Not only is it extra special for that reason, but also we have an amazing group of panelists for you. And we're going to be discussing today beyond the gender binary, which is a really important topic, not only for the legal profession, but for society in general. It's an issue and an area that I am definitely a learner in. So I'm really excited to learn from today's panelists and to think about how issues of gender binary intersect with the legal profession and society generally. So it's going to be just a great conversation. So for today's structure and format, we're going to do things a little bit differently. So each of the panelists is going to introduce themselves and kind of give their perspectives and their background and frame where their comments are coming from. And then after we've done that, we're going to open it up for conversation between our panelists, which I think will be just lovely to have that natural back and forth. I'll interject on occasion, perhaps, with a question, but otherwise we're going to let them go and just learn from them. And we're so appreciative for their hard work for today. And then at about 40 minutes or so after the hour, I will interrupt and jump back in and be your moderator for today. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a Q&A button. So feel free, and you don't have to wait until it's officially Q&A time. You can jump in at any time with questions, but feel free to drop those into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. And then when the time comes, I will ask those of our panelists and I will be their moderator. We do have a fourth panelist who is unfortunately dealing with some pretrial matters today, Kylar Broadus. So he'll be hopefully joining us a little bit later, and we'll give him some time to introduce himself when he joins us later today. But with that, we'll go in alphabetical order, and that gives us first Dr. Joél Arvizo-Zavala to introduce themselves and get us started.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me on this panel today, Dean Kronk Warner. It's a wonderful privilege to be here with such wonderful individuals as well. So my name is Dr. Joél Arvizo-Zavala. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I serve as the Chief Executive Officer for Resilient Education Consulting. I also have the opportunity and privilege to work in academia as an assistant professor of medical education here at one of the medical schools here in California. Just really excited to talk to all of you about this book, Beyond the Gender Binary, my own journey of gender, and to work in collaboration with our other panelists today. Thank you so much.
And next we have our very own fabulous 3L student, Kim Koeven.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dean Kronk Warner. Yeah, I'm super excited. I'm a 3L. I'm on the DEI Committee at the Quinney College of Law. And just this book, I guess, also has a lot of meaning to me. And especially, I think, throughout my career, as I've been learning as a student and throughout law school, just kind of how gender intersects with the law. And so I'm just super excited to be here with Dr. Joél and Professor Marino.
And last but certainly not least, Professor Marino.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ani Marino. I am the clinical instructor for Harvard Law School's LGBTQ+ Advocacy Clinic. It is my inaugural year. Before joining Harvard Law School, I was Deputy Legal Director for the American Civil Liberties Union Foundation of Florida, where I oversaw work regarding voting rights, LGBTQ rights, particularly within the area of access to gender-affirming care. I'm originally from South Florida, which is Seminole land, but now live in Massachusetts, which is home to the Wampanoag tribe. I'm so incredibly thrilled to be here with you this morning. You know, there are many themes throughout this book that we're discussing this morning that resonate very deeply with me and my own experience, particularly the argument that's being made regarding the struggle that members of the transgender, nonconforming, and non-binary community have regarding arguing for their very ability to exist, which indeed is one of the reasons why I oftentimes say that the law chose me, or that I felt compelled to go into the law based on the experiences that I had growing up, witnessing the experiences that many of my trans and gender nonconforming siblings have encountered throughout their lives, and then also having lost a very dear friend of mine while I was an undergrad. It's wonderful to be here with you this morning. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Marino. That actually just occurred to me. Maybe a good starting point is a discussion of, you mentioned this book is important, maybe a discussion of that, the book, what the book covers and why it's important to you or your careers, and then we can launch into our conversation.
Sure, I'm happy to get us started if that makes sense. So I think one of the things that preliminarily really resonated with me, again, would be on page 16, where the author really discusses how many members of the community are still indeed arguing for their very ability to exist. And I think the last 2 years have really demonstrated how pervasive violence and discrimination against transgender, non-binary, and gender nonconforming people is, not only across the country, but also globally. So for example, there were over 100 bills that were introduced during the 2021 legislative session, intending to essentially eliminate access to trans and non-binary people in any number of different spheres. The majority of which, however, dealt with access to athletic programs in scholastic environments. Several also dealt with access to care, gender-affirming care, particularly for those who are minors. There are over 60 bills that are presently before legislatures during the 2022 term, many of which also deal with access to programs that cisgender counterparts are able to avail themselves of on a daily basis. Obtaining accurate government identification is still consistently an issue for many members of the community. And indeed, the inability to access authentic and accurate gender identification oftentimes means that it places members of the community at risk when they're seeking employment, particularly if they have to file an I-9, or if they're trying to access places of public accommodation, whether it be a movie theater, if they want to see an R-rated movie and there's a question regarding that individual's age, purchasing certain goods and services, and indeed even as I did recently, flying on an airplane. And then, violence is still a huge issue within the community. There is an approximate 51 individuals who suffered horrible fatalities in the United States over the course of 2021. It's at least recorded on record as being the deadliest year for trans and non-binary folk in the United States. And consistent with that, there were over 375 deaths reported globally. So I will say that the argument regarding the ability to exist is still very, very relevant today.
And I'll go ahead and add on to that. Thank you so much, Professor Marino, for getting us started today. I think for me, also looking at page 16, I went to that page when you mentioned it. There was a portion that I underlined, and the author writes, I do not have the luxury of being. I am only seen as doing, as if my gender is something that is being done to them and not something that belongs to me. That's something that really resonated with me. For me, I have the privilege of really, I think very much like my gender fluidity, I also have professional fluidity. I have I have worked in a lot of different realms in the field of education, in the field of law, specifically as a court liaison, and now more recently, in the field of medicine. And when I think about this book and its relevance to law and maybe other fields, I think about this particular quote. I think when I was working for the Utah Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice, for example, when we were tracking those pieces of legislation, we were looking at criminal justice issues specifically, but as a legislative tracker, I also had access to all the pieces of legislation and looking at, last year where an anti-trans bill was coming in through Utah's legislative session. That was really difficult for me, being a legislative tracker and wanting to promote criminal legal reform, for example. Looking at these other bills that are affecting, communities of color and trans communities specifically. And so for me, I think I wasn't able to articulate it as eloquently as the author in this text, but that notion of gender being done to others was very present for me during last year's legislative session and also through today. I think about how often the laws are used to determine whether or not an individual can exist, where they can exist, how they can exist. And it goes back to the policing of gender, as the author talks about. And as many of us who work in the field of law and other fields, and in conjunction with gender and issues of gender and gender identity, we know that policing happens. It happens to us, right? I think about my experiences being raised and growing up in Utah, where my gender was constantly policed. Luckily, I had a few teachers, just very few, 3. I know all 3 of them to this day. 3 teachers who gave me a safe space, right, to practice gender, to be gender fluid, to do things with my gender that others wouldn't. And I think having just those few glimmers of hope allowed me to become the gender fluid individual that I am today. But similar to what Professor Marino discussed just a moment ago, flying can be a challenge. There are times, because as a gender fluid individual, there are times where I'm more feminine and times where I'm more masculine. And flying once in particular, where I was more feminine, caused some troubles going through TSA, some questions and some, curiosities, I guess, about who I was or really what I was. And that experience, sort of stayed with me. But luckily, because of the small amounts of support that I did get as a child and now as an adult, I choose to be gender fluid and do those things for myself, right? The gender is mine. And although people may see gender as being something done to them, to the best of my ability, I try to ignore those things so that I can just be happy with who I am.
Yeah, thanks, Joelle. I would also just adding on to that, I think, so I also grew up here in Utah, and as a kid, I've always just kind of been who I am. And so, bathrooms for me were just always like it was a problem. It was like a weekly thing in elementary school. And I think, and it was an inconvenience to other people, right? Like me being in the bathroom or me being in certain spaces, was something that I could tell was very inconvenient, and people would make it quite known. And so I think, part of the reason why as well, and in the DEI committee as well, really wanted to do this book is just to also kind of, do as Alok is doing and get voices out there and talking about our experiences and just, because there are so many trans and gender nonconforming kids and youth in Utah who are struggling, and who don't necessarily have the support that they need or necessarily know per se what's happening at depending on how old they are. They may not have the cognitive or social emotional skills yet to even deal with some of the things that they're having to face with kind of backlash and others. And so, yeah, for sure, I think just being is something that's so in itself so radical. Yes.
I actually did really want to turn back just briefly to something that Dr. Arvizo-Zavala, you noted yourself, which involves the policing of gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity, and how it's been such an issue for members of the LGBTQ community for decades, really, if not longer. If one were to look back to what predicated the Stonewall Street riots, it was the policing of LGBTQ identities within social spaces. And then we saw cases like Bowers v. Hardwick, which was an effort to overturn certain sodomy laws that were used to criminalize LGBTQ plus identities. And then ultimately, the eradication of those laws that were used in a way disparately against LGBTQ plus people in Lawrence versus Texas in 2004. But the reality is, notwithstanding the success that Lawrence was for members of the LGBTQ community, policing of LGBTQ identities occurs still on a daily basis. It's just perhaps not as pertinent to certain members of the community who maintain certain privileges of being cisgender, white, and male. But there are certainly other members of the community who experience it on a daily basis. Walking while trans, gender nonconforming, or binary is still a huge issue for members of the community. And certain laws regarding sex solicitation are commonly used against members of the community while they're simply out socializing with their friends. And so that's just something I wanted to raise. That's indeed consistent with what you already noted.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I think I want to talk a little bit about the intersections of law and education here a little bit as well. When I worked in the field of education in K-12 schools specifically, because of my own queer identity and gender identity at the time, had a lot of young folks come to me and confide in me their challenges regarding their gender identity. For the youth that I worked with, it wasn't ever an issue of confusion of one's gender identity. It was, this is who I am and I'm scared to be who I am, right? That was consistently the conversation. For the older youth, a lot of times it was, as an educator, asking really hard questions of the administration, of the district personnel to sort of figure out, okay, what are my limits here? What can I do? What can I not do? And all of it was dictated by the law, right? And it was really difficult. Towards the latter part of my term in K-12 education, we had a very young individual come out as trans. She was a transgender girl, was trans feminine. And that sparked a lot of difficult conversation among staff, including a teacher who came to my office who was struggling with the very fact of, this is wrong. And this teacher was coming from the perspective of, it's not legally recognized, what are we supposed to do? Plus the religious piece that was tied to it, right? And so these interconnections between law and education and religion were all present for people. Eventually, this was in the year, 2016, right? Where the legal landscape had changed just enough in the state of Utah so that we could have gender affirming restrooms, right? We could create some safe spaces. We could have gender affirming literature in the classroom, right? Because that was one of the things that we were even advocating or asking about, can we have gender affirming literature in the class, in these classes, what's happening here? And by that particular point, the legislative landscape, like I said, had just shifted just enough so that we could provide a safer space for this transgender girl, this trans feminine girl to transition and to become, who she is and to honor who she is and to get into that, right? Get into the space of her identity. But it was a challenge. It was really hard. For me, working in the field of education, I think the challenge was everyone was always looking to the outside for answers versus trying to look internally to do what was right, regardless of what, was happening elsewhere. So I wanted to mention those pieces too. Supporting transgender LGBTQI plus youth is a challenge. And there are intersections between education and the law that we can't be blind to.
Yeah, definitely. I can kind of continue to speak on that a little bit as well. So I taught science for a little while as well. And I think that was one of the reasons why I wanted to go back and teach, because like you had mentioned, Joelle, it's just having those couple of teachers who were there for you and were that space for you, and knowing like that was also my experience, was just knowing that I had those couple people in my corner. And I think, certainly that's something as educators and, even in law school, like as something that I think people can take into consideration, like professors. I mean, people, it's real, but like people don't want to use pronouns, or people don't necessarily like take the time to just like create the space so that it's inclusive for everyone. And I think that's just something, obviously it's hard and maybe it's uncomfortable work, but hopefully, with time we'll start to see more of that as well, just in all realms, and as well as in the legal profession. I guess that's something, Professor Marino, I was going to ask you, like, do you see, I think something that I'm seeing, at least, or I'm experiencing as well, is just as far as like dressing and professionalism and things like that, like existing in a professional space, like what have you noticed, like, in especially like the legal field, like just kind of like how people have navigated that, or kind of the attitudes towards that? Yeah.
Sure, Kim, that's a great question. And so I'll open by saying that it's getting better than it was when I first went to law school, but we have a long way to go. So I'll share with you, as I noted earlier, I felt compelled to go into law because of my own experiences as a trans Latina woman, the experiences of many of my trans and gender nonconforming siblings. And then I sadly lost a very close friend of mine with whom I engaged in transgender activism in 2006. Her name was Venus LaBeija. She and I lived in Baltimore, Maryland together. I was attending Johns Hopkins at the time. And one evening she met a man, and unfortunately, that man bludgeoned her, and she died at Johns Hopkins Bayview Hospital 6 days later, after suffering in a coma for 6 days, to only have her murderer walk on the charges and then ultimately be charged, arrested, and convicted of his wife's murder a decade later. But that was really what prompted my shift from doing general policy work into wanting to really make my career in the law. But at the time when I was looking at the legal landscape, there really weren't any people with stories like mine or who looked like me. There were a few trailblazers within the trans community who made it in the legal profession, but typically they did so after working in a covered fashion for the vast majority of their careers, and then coming out later as a member of the trans community after having practiced for several decades. And so at the time, I spoke to several friends and family that were in the law before I even applied to law school. And I was actually out as a trans woman while I was at Johns Hopkins, and decided, based on the existing legal landscape at the time, that it actually made sense for me to go back in the closet and to pretend to be a cisgender gay man for 3 years of law school and an additional 6+ years of practice, because it simply did not feel safe for me to be authentic in those spaces. And, I fortunately had the luxury of not having undergone certain extents of gender affirming care, and not to say that it's a luxury, if you will, but I think what I mean to say is it was easier for me to conceal my identity back then, such that I didn't feel like I was placing myself in any danger. But even when I presented myself as an extremely feminine gay man, I noticed that my competencies, my intellect, were often dismissed by my classmates, and oftentimes by supervisors. I recall one instance where I went to a firm night during my first year of law school, where they invited students who were, excelling academically to go to a firm and meet with partners at the firm and learn about the firm's culture. And what I learned during that event was that firm life would be an extremely challenging place for me because not one male partner at that firm spoke to me the entire evening. And so I decided to go back to my career development office. And I simply said, I've signed up for these other events. I just simply don't think this is the right thing for me. And so I kind of moved myself into government work and into doing social justice, which is what I really saw myself doing anyway, but in part because I also felt like I was unwelcome in certain spaces within the legal community, which is one of the reasons why I continued to cover my own identity for a number of years, even after graduating from law school. And it really wasn't until I joined the ACLU of Florida that I felt safe enough to be myself, because I was in an affirming environment where people were gender diverse and I could just live freely without the concern of having my competencies questioned constantly, being treated disparately by either my coworkers or by a supervisor, which happened frequently when I was in private practice and in government. And having that moment where I could finally live freely was so liberating for me, in part because I had such a supportive supervisor. And he really transformed my career. And I really attribute a lot of the success that I've been able to have today because of the support and encouragement that he provided me when I finally decided to live authentically again. And I vividly remember actually one discussion that we were having as I was preparing for Florida Supreme Court argument in a voting rights case, because I was very concerned about how the court would respond to my presentation and whether my presentation would actually be a distraction in a case that wasn't about me. It was about 1.4 million Floridians seeking voter restoration. And, we had a lengthy discussion regarding my need to feel comfortable before the court and to present myself authentically and to just simply focus on the law, which is what I was there to do. But it was an affirming environment that I will say is still relatively rare in the legal profession. And there are certainly a number of challenges that still exist. So for example, there are 5 trans women of color in the movement or who are movement adjacent. 2 of us are at Harvard Law School. 2 are at the ACLU, and 1 is currently in private practice, but used to work for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. So we have some presence, but there is a lot more work to do, particularly when it comes to making space for gender nonconforming and non-binary people. And pronouns continues to be a very challenging issue for members of the community because people dismiss the need for using they, them pronouns. And that tends to be one of the biggest hurdles that non-binary and gender nonconforming people encounter in workplaces, in addition to issues related to professional attire, which is, it's an incredibly unfortunate and frustrating experience, and certainly something that we at the clinic are dedicated to changing through, the production of certain resource guides so that people better understand a non-binary and gender nonconforming experience.
I want to add on to that, and going back, to Beyond the Gender Binary book, the author spends quite a bit of time talking about, the use of pronouns, right, and the importance of that in terms of providing an affirming, caring environment for gender fluid, transgender individuals, gender non-binary folks as well. And so for me, as an individual who uses they, them pronouns, I think it's really important for all of us to just really humanize the process, right? When people use my incorrect pronouns or incorrect pronouns for me, my initial reaction isn't, okay, I need to correct you. My initial reaction is, let me see if this person can correct themselves, right? And I think it speaks back to the larger organizational cultures that we have to operate within, whether that's law or otherwise. We need organizational cultures and we need systems that are prepared for us before we even enter the door. We need individuals to take on that autonomy and agency and the leadership, to learn about these things. Currently, outside of my private practice, I work for a university. And at this particular university, every single person, students, faculty, and staff are required to engage in some sort of anti-oppressive, anti-racist education. And I had a really difficult, but at the end of it, very fruitful conversation with a faculty member, where this faculty member brought up this concern about, you're making us do this, what if some of us don't need it? And, initially my reaction was, all of us need this, right? This is not, there's a reason why it's a requirement. There's a reason why we're asking everyone to engage in this discomfort. Even for me as an individual who's leading out on these efforts, I too am choosing material that's making me uncomfortable because it's important for me to learn and grow alongside other individuals. And at the end of the day, if the only reason is I don't want people to feel as uncomfortable or as ostracized or as oppressed as I felt, then that's worth it. But it's bigger than that, right? It's always bigger than that. And so I think part of what I want to encourage folks to understand and to do is have your organizations be prepared before we even enter. As Professor Marino mentioned just a moment ago, 5 transgender women, right? Sort of leading out these efforts in the legal field. And there's going to be more. There is already more. Don't wait for us to do the work for you. Do the work before we even get there, right? And I can't stress that enough.
I was actually going to jump in on that because that was a question I had, and going to your point earlier about looking internally to do what's right. I would love to hear panelists' thoughts on what that work should look like, both perhaps in the law school, and then also, since this is kind of legally focused, what legal employers can do, or I guess all employers, it's not unique to legal employers, to do that work ahead of time to create an environment that is welcoming for all individuals. Would just love to hear suggestions that you may have of tangible changes that can or should be made.
Yeah, I can start off on that. I think definitely in the law school experience, professors can definitely, they can make an effort to really use people's pronouns and to take time to ask. It might take 5 minutes, but it is worth the time. And like Dr. Joél said, it's one of those things where a lot of gender nonconforming people and people who use they, them pronouns, gender fluid people and trans people, they're not going to actively correct, right, the individual who is making a mistake. They may not, that's a personal choice. But also just knowing that that's an energy thing as well. And that, there may only be a handful of people in their life that do actually use their pronouns. And so all day they're getting maybe 1 or 2 people, or, all week they're getting maybe 1 or 2 people that do, and then everyone else isn't. So just being mindful, it makes a huge difference. It really is just so helpful in just that basic affirmation of just being and existing and being seen. I do think the law school has made efforts. Certainly I've had some really, really amazing professors, but I also just think there's a lot of work that, can be done generally. And just our numbers, we don't have, like Professor Marino mentioned, being one of 5, trans women of color, we are not seeing, at our law school, we don't have a lot of gender nonconforming or trans individuals of color. We don't have, we're getting more diverse, but we're certainly not, where we need to be. And I don't even like the term diverse, but I mean, we're certainly not meeting the numbers in the population that would be representative of who we are as Utahns. And I know the administration is making great efforts. I think it's also to just in general, the community as students and as faculty, and just as a whole, we can all, work to make that space more inclusive. So it's certainly something that we can all do together.
I just want to piggyback him off of something that you noted and just reference back to there being 5 trans women of color that currently exist within the movement space. And the reality is that, some of these challenges are very cyclical in nature, right? So a lot of it has to do with creating equitable, inclusive environments for people at a very early age, because what we oftentimes see is that, unfortunately, many members of our community just simply don't have the means and opportunity to pursue their dreams based on social stigma that still persists regarding gender stereotypes. And so generating these more inclusive environments certainly fosters a person's ability to, during their formative years, really develop their skills and confidence and capacities such that they can go ahead and pursue further opportunities that they otherwise would have, foreclosed for themselves. I can certainly speak from experience. When I was looking into the law, I remember one of my closest friends during undergrad who was a complete rock star. She was a finalist for both the Marshall and the Rhodes Scholar and scholarships, and she was going to Yale Law in the fall. And I remember when she and I were celebrating these interviews that she was going to for the Rhodes Scholarship, I said, wow, I really want to be able to pursue the law myself. And she said to me, well, you can. But when I looked around the room, I didn't think it was something that was possible for me based on what I saw within the community at the time, and just simply the challenges that I had encountered all the way through my education. And so it wasn't until you really find those voices that are affirming and supportive that many members of the community find themselves in a position where they can actually say, okay, this is something that I indeed feel like I am deserving of. And can pursue, because oftentimes that just simply isn't the case for many members of the community. They don't feel supported or encouraged. As far as pronouns are concerned, it's incredibly important. And what I would say is, it's always really good to check in with an individual if you see someone being misgendered, and I tend to do that quite frequently. I've had students who have been misgendered or colleagues who have misgendered. And what I do preliminarily is check in with them, ask them how they're doing, acknowledge what occurred, and then ask them how they want me to handle it. Do you want me to say something? Would you like to say something? And I think that perhaps provides them a little bit more power as well regarding how they want to handle the situation when there are instances where they are subject to misgendering.
I want to quickly add on to that, and I see that Kylar has joined us. Welcome, Kylar. Thank you for being here today. So I think my addition to that is looking at the latter half of the book, the Beyond the Gender Binary. One of the things that the author does is separate questions into different categories, such as dismissal, biology, and slippery slope. And I would say that these questions could serve as a very necessary and fruitful foundation to helping organizations in their, desires to be more inclusive. I think about when I read through the book the first time, and the second time in preparation for today's panel, I thought to myself during the second read, I said, these questions are so familiar to me. And I just kind of took a moment to honor their familiarity. And I realized, oh my goodness, what would it look like for other folks who are not LGBTQI, who are not transgender, not gender fluid, non-gender binary, to look at these questions and say, are these questions familiar to you? Are these questions that you've asked yourself when you've been in the presence of gender fluid or transgender individuals? Are these questions that you ask yourself when you see legislation, being discussed in the news and media? And I think those questions are crucial. Because for me, as a gender fluid individual, I know my ability. I know my ability to sit in discomfort, to persevere through difficulty, to overcome fear and anxiety and worry. I'm not as aware, nor should I be, of everyone else's ability to overcome fear, worry, and anxiety. And these questions, a lot of them come from a place of fear. And so as organizations, I encourage you to go where the fear is, right? Utilize some of these questions that are in this text to help individuals start with their fear so that they don't project that fear onto us when we're there. I think that's crucial.
And I wanted to also welcome Kylar. Kylar, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're busy today with Trial Matters, but if you wanted to perhaps briefly introduce yourself, and then we were talking a little bit about the topic of what law schools and employers in general can do to make a more welcoming environment for all individuals.
Thank you, and I do apologize for being late, but I am juggling a trial and this panel, which isn't the smartest thing, but that's how I've gotten here. I do think law schools, law firms, etc., can do a lot. I have served on lots of committees at not necessarily the beginning, but the beginning of this round of trans inclusiveness, to talk about that with law schools, with bar associations, etc. And I've heard a lot of great answers as I came on, by the way, the two folks answering. And I think one is being open, listening to what people want. And these are things I heard coming on, but these are recommendations I've given for years, is ask people what they want to be called, and then make systematic changes so that this can happen, so that it's not every time students come through, it's a one-off. Oh, now we have to redo the system to make this happen so that it's uncomfortable for each student. It shouldn't be, we change names all the time in law schools. People get married, people die, people get adopted. There's all sorts of reasons people change names, and this is just another one. So let's not act like it's a surprise or a big deal, and let's allow people to be who they are. And I think that is, while there are parts of the law or reasons I got into the law to make change, law is slow at making change internal and externally. And we should be leaders in that. And this is one area we can be leaders. And so quickly to that is just what I said. Let's open up. That's why we do what we do as whatever area of law we practice in. We're here to help make change. And this is one of them. Ask people how they choose to be named, and let's put in systems. And that's the question. And I always get, it's like, well, we don't have the system to do that then. It's like, and then I say, oh, but you make last name changes. Oh, well, yeah, we do. And then other people want to go by different first names, and you do that too. Well, yeah, we do that. So then I'm like, well, what system changes do you need to make that you can't make for us then? Then you're already making it. So let's stop pretending and let's do what's right for all people. We're all human beings.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Those are some great recommendations, and I really appreciate it because I'm certainly learning a lot. So we have about 16 minutes left. So for those of us, or those of you who are joining us as participants, just a reminder, if you do have any questions, feel free to drop those into the Q&A you'll see at the bottom of the screen. And I'll be happy to ask those questions of our panelists. One question to get us started on, I'd love to get your insights. I was chatting with Jason Perry the other day, who helps the University of Utah quite a bit with our legislative work and is very busy right now working with the legislature. And he had mentioned just in the first week, so the Utah legislature meets not consistently throughout the year. It meets for a couple of months at the beginning of the year. And he had mentioned that already in the first week of the legislative session, they had been addressing and talking about two specific bills, one dealing with trans athletes and the other dealing with individuals who identify as trans within the educational system. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Why is that? Why two trans bills out of the gate the first week of the legislative session. I was a little surprised to hear that. It seemed like a lot in kind of the first week when there are so many other things to deal with, right? COVID, probably top on that list. Thoughts on that? Why is that? What can we be doing better as a society?
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. Kylar, did you want to start us off?
No, go ahead. Fine.
So what I will say is that we're seeing a nationwide kind of movement towards the regulation and policing of trans youth and of trans bodies. And I think it's in large part a continuation of a theme that those who maintain power and subject others to othering continue to do. And I think, this in some part ties back to the discussion we had earlier regarding how a lot of the challenges that members of the community face are cyclical, right? Because when you legislate in areas that deny trans youth or non-binary youth access, whether it's access to scholastic athletic programs, scholastic to gender affirming care, access to education, it sends a very clear message. And that message is you're unwelcome, you're unvalued. And it makes it very challenging for youth as they continue to develop during their formative years to feel empowered and to maintain the confidence necessary to contribute the way that many of us would like to. And so one of the things that I would do would be to urge anyone who has an open heart and mind to consider just how harmful a lot of these proposed bills are. And to also consider, particularly because when this discussion occurs within the context of athletics, that women come in all different shapes and sizes, right? Not all of us are the same. We all have different experiences. And I think it's inherently suggesting that if you're excluding an entire group of women, it's in part because those who are perhaps proposing this legislation or sponsoring this legislation simply don't believe that trans women are women, when indeed they are. We just come in different forms at times. We have perhaps a not standard experience, but that doesn't mean we're any less of a member of that community. And I think this also goes in part to what the author discusses about disrupting certain standards or the status quo, right? And we had some discussion earlier about discomfort. And the reality is, I think oftentimes that those who maintain power don't know how to address the discomfort that they maintain when they encounter it. And so, a very visceral reaction is to just simply reject or to act hostilely towards that feeling of discomfort. And what I would do is to simply say, I challenge those who are in positions of power and who have the ability to create greater access for members of the community to really sit with that discomfort and ask themselves why they feel the way that they do. Members of the trans, non-binary, and gender conforming community find themselves engaging in this introspection on a daily basis. We have to help understand our identities, in part because we recognize that there are certain distinctions between us and other members of the community growing up because we may not fit within the standard, right? But asking other people to actually look introspectively and to examine their own genders and identities can be very scary, but it can also be an incredibly liberating experience.
And I'll jump in, or if you just wanted one answer, this is one I've been answering a lot and on national TV, in fact, regarding these pieces of legislation which have taken over the last 3 years. Partly, and everything Anya said, I totally agree with. Want to make sure I said that correctly, Anya. And the other layer of it is they see no national path. So when they see no national path to tear down an other, then we work the state path. So therefore, because they knew coming in that President Biden was not going to tear down trans people. You know, it was clear from his prior experience in the Obama administration. He made many faux pas, and one of them was speaking before President Obama about trans people, and it being the trans civil rights era. Those were some of his faux pas, speaking before the president when there was a president. And so he would say things like that, and they're like, "You mean President Obama doesn't?" And that wasn't true either, because the Obamas knew trans people and had worked with trans people for decades. But he would make those statements, and those are some of his slips that would come out. And those were good slips, because that would get us press and garner the press and solidify the press, so people knew where he stood, and people certainly knew where Vice President Kamala Harris from California stood, where California has some of the most pioneering legislation in the United States regarding trans people. So they knew there was no national path to tearing down, and they knew there would be work on the national level, which I've done for decades on a national and state level in various places. But they knew that the Equality Act, whether people like it or not, but it's the closest things we've had to national legislation, and the House itself bought up the Equality Act and passed it. Before, we've had to nudge with sticks, boards, hammers. Don't mean to be so violent, people. I'm just from a rural area. But whatever we had to get the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate to even recognize legislation and move it forward. We had come to an era, even way back when I testified in 2012, where the Senate and the House were now working legislation on its own, saying, wow, we got to do something because these LGBT people are a powerful household, or have powerful households. So now if we want to get votes, we have to work LGBTQ people. So so at that point, they started working LGBTQ people and issues that impacted LGBTQ people on the national level. And more than likely, had we not had the 45, not quite sure what to call that, we would have had national LGBTQ legislation, which is what everybody was pushing for, if we had had a Mitt Romney or anybody else, because everybody and a lot of the senators we lost that just quit we had enough votes to pass it. Well, when 45 came in, all those people scurried for their life and got off the ship as soon as possible. So we lost all those votes, and now we're having to get those votes. And at the same time, they started the dual attack at the state level to start attacking trans kids and trans people in every way possible, because they didn't have the strong power hold at the national level. And now, unfortunately, it's unfurled to where we have this mass attack going on state by state, because if you recall, we had beat back North Carolina, and we had beat back Indiana and made Pence unsign the bill that he signed into law in Indiana regarding gay people, and to that quick turn to how they're attacking all state houses. So for the last 3 legislative sessions, they have been pre-prepared to unleash these bills in any kind of format to attack and to limit rights of trans people, particularly our trans youth, because they see, aha, this is something that's vulnerable, and this is something that we can attack, because they've got governors out there that will pass these pieces of legislation and sign them into law, and they don't have to go against somebody like President Biden, who would not sign anything like that into law. So I'll stop there, but that gives you an idea of the political landscape and why it's easier to attack a state house than it is the national house, because those pieces of legislation are not going to make it through the national house, although that's going to change depending on what happens in the next cycle coming up here for elections, because if we don't get people out, and with the sway of the Voting Rights Act, that's their intent, to not get voters out, and to show everybody that their vote doesn't count, when in fact people's votes still does count, rather, or it does. Pardon me, my language and talking too much today already is not well. So, but you get my point. So.
Well, we have about 4 minutes left. So any final thoughts to leave us with? And I have to say a big thank you already. This has been incredibly, I know I've learned a lot, so I really appreciate your work and sharing with us today.
Well, I hate to have missed this wonderful panel with everybody on it. You know, you guys are so vibrant and smart. Thank you for allowing me to be on it, and my apologies again for coming late, but we need to have more of these. So thank you, Dean Warner, for having this panel. And I will just say this, that I've been in the worst climate for trans people, but yet I've seen more rights than we expected to garner coming through that window. We never expected to get anything. So with that, I'll say I'm not giving up, and I hope that many people don't give up, because I plan to fight like hell until I can't fight anymore. And I hope that we all do that, and I hope that we can come together as a community. I know we're all different communities, but I think what we have to understand is when they plan to kill us, they don't plan to divide us and kill us. They just plan to kill us. And if you can see that from the legislation. And so, and I see each wave come in, and we're all different, and we want to all be special. But the specialness is they just want to kill us because we're different. And while I love everybody being unique, and I love uniqueness, hence Kylar and who I am, I think that's wonderful. But I think we have to remember that we all must love each other in our uniqueness, and we all must stand together to fight, because there are more of them than us, and that we must fight back this negativity towards the other, whatever other that is, because I'm on every other bandwagon you'll see me on. And I think that's important, but particularly the trans, non-binary, however we want to title it. You know, I've seen us go through so many titles over the years, and let's not fight about title. They're not fighting about title, because when I go on the Hill and lobby, they just think we're all gay. And that's something I laugh about, because I used to argue about that. It's like, should we really separate ourselves from gay people? Because you know what? They don't know any different when I go on the Hill and lobby, and then I break it down to them, because they're like, well, don't you have everything? And it's like, well, no, we don't. And here I go. Here's why we're different, and here's why we're not the same as gay people. And then they're just like ecstatic. And it's like, I'm not leaving. I'm still going to sit here and tell you why we're different and what we need. But my point being is that we have to do that work, because we're making assumptions like Dr. I'm not trying to say your name, but Joelle, if I may, said when I was coming in, it's very important for us to do that work. And if we don't do that work to educate them, and to show them that they have one in every family, if not more, that's also something I think eye-opening. Because I used to do a training because I look just like my father, I look just like my cousins, and before we became so famous as trans people, and I never came out until the end. And I'd let people bash us and do everything, and I wouldn't bash with. I would just let them bash away. And at the end, I came out, and they were like, "Oh wow, it doesn't matter." It's like, "Oh wow, it just doesn't matter, does it?" Because we're all human beings, and you made lots of assumptions, but yet you like me. So what does that say? And so with that, I will not take up any more time, but I did want to share a little bit more of my thoughts. since I came to the game late, and did want to share a little bit more with you and this lovely panel that was put together. So thank you all.
Well, thank you. I want to make sure that everybody has time for concluding thoughts, although on some level, I love that kind of final message of just love everyone, we're all humans. But I want to give everybody else just 30 seconds, 1 minute to conclude, and then unfortunately our time will be up.
I'll go ahead and go. I think moving forward, one thing that I want to share with everyone is there is currently a documentary on Netflix called Disclosure. It is rated TV MA, and if you haven't had the opportunity to watch it, I definitely encourage you to do so. Documentaries, just like books, yeah, thank you, Professor Marino. It's a powerful documentary, so please be prepared. For those of us who are non-binary, gender fluid, transgender, make sure you have your tissue box next to you because it is one of those sort of experiences. But I really encourage folks to watch that documentary, to read the book, Beyond the Gender Binary. I have the book Trans Like Me just behind me here. There are so many books and documentaries out there, fewer documentaries, but a lot more books that can help us learn and grow, individually and collectively as a community. And I would say my final thoughts for today are, if you're here watching this today, if you watch it later on, on YouTube, remember that we are here, we are out there, and we deserve respect and dignity, right, at the end of the day. I think for those of us who are gender non-binary and transgender, we offer dignity and respect to everyone else around us, and so we really deserve it in return. And really encourage folks to think about what that means for you. Appreciate your time today.
I guess I can share. Let me begin simply by saying, first, thank you again so much for having me here. And to those of you who are joining us today or who may be watching this later, who had an opportunity to read this book, Beyond the Binary, really take a moment and pause, let it sit with you and see how many of the experiences that are conveyed throughout this book are things that actually resonate with you. The reality is when we talk about when I say we, I mean when people generally talk about LGBTQ people, it's oftentimes about identifying the differences that exist between us and those who maintain power. But the reality is, if you actually take the time to read this book and you see some of the experiences that Alok Vaid-Menon goes through when it comes to policing their own presentation and their own experience as a child, that's something so many of us experience, whether you identify as cisgender or trans or non-binary or gender non-conforming. And so, one of the things that I would really echo from what Kylar said earlier is, I think it's time we acknowledge our similarities. I think it's time we actually acknowledge that we're all entitled, as Dr. Arvizo-Zavala said, to basic human dignity and respect. And coming at it from that angle, trying to understand someone who, yes, perhaps may have differences from you, but the reality is that they probably have significantly more similarities to you than you realize. So take that moment and actually get to know an individual. Walk, a mile in their shoes if you can. Listen to their experience. And then ask yourself, if you see things that make you uncomfortable, why does it make you uncomfortable? Is it because that you don't understand it? Or is it because you also see an injustice happening to someone else? And if you do see that injustice, I challenge you to speak up. Speak up, say something, articulate that it's not right, and then be part of the solution to make things better for everyone.
I just want to thank all the panelists for coming. We're so grateful that you could all take time out of your schedules to come and talk with us. I'm just echoing so much of what's already been said. But yeah, Alok's book, I think especially just spoke to me and kind of, has been reiterated. Just this normative that we've allowed ourselves to live in, and we've created, this binary that is it's a construct, and that's kind of, this journey that Alok goes through of kind of decoding and breaking down this construct throughout the book. And so just like Professor Marino said, like taking that time and Kylar and Dr. Joél said, just to participate and be an active participant and an active ally in that effort to help deconstruct it, right? Because until it's deconstructed, until we have a space where it's normal for everyone to just be who they are, right? Somebody is always going to be getting cut, and being cut doesn't mean the physical; it means the words on the page. It's the lack of the pronoun use. It's the spaces that gender nonconforming and gender fluid and trans people have to try to fit themselves in that they don't want to be in, right? So I think just to echo kind of what's already been said, and one final parting thing is, what was said earlier this year at BYU was not okay, and by certain religious leaders. And I think that was something that was not addressed by, and I realize that we have many people who affiliate with certain religious groups, and that even within those religious groups, there's people that don't have those ideologies. But it's also important that we point out that it's never okay to make people feel unsafe. And when we have religious leaders make comments and make students at BYU feel unsafe and make the youth feel unsafe, and especially make trans and gender nonconforming people who stand out feel unsafe, it's not okay. And we're better than that. And like was kind of previously echoed, like, we're humans at the base of all of this. It's human first. And, that's just something I think just to end on, and I guess my comments. So thank you all.
I like that theme of humans first. Wonderful. I want to thank again, I think Karen in the comments said it best. They say, thank you to all the panelists. This has been excellent. I absolutely agree. Again, I want to thank you for your work. I know it's both emotionally draining to talk about these topics and to have to keep on talking about these topics, and then also just for all the work that you've done to be such amazing panelists. I know I speak for myself, and I speak for probably everybody else who have attended, that we learned a lot, and we really appreciate that labor and that work. So thank you. Wonderful panel. And then I want to just invite everybody. We'll be back next month. February is Black History Month. So we'll be talking about Black history and educating ourselves on that. So I hope you'll join us again next month. But in the meantime, again, big thank you to our panelists, and enjoy the end of the month, everyone. Thank you so much. We'll see you next month.